Okay, today we continue on Job. Today we're going to talk about the second of Job's friends. His name is Bildad. And Bildad is a traditionalist, as we're going to see, and that has a different approach to this as well. But I want to start by asking you the question: what are the traditions you have or keep? Holiday type things, the turkey and all that stuff. Okay, okay. Some people travel, some people stay at home. Some people travel and wish they could stay at home. So that was our situation. What traditions do you have? Church on Sunday, okay. Why is that traditional? That's a good answer. What's that?
Somebody keeps pushing me out the door.
Well, somebody makes you come to church. Yeah, well, that's what we did with our grandkids this morning. Said you got to come to church. I mean, so I don't know where that leaves you in that spectrum, but okay. It's getting later and later. Well, okay, but you live close, and that's good. So, absolutely. Any other traditions you have? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sure. Stop and remember. Okay. Those are important things. Kind of like my parents' birthdays and death days. I go to the cemetery. Is it because I need to? I don't know. It's what you do. And I have been informed by my youngest daughter that we're being cremated because she doesn't visit cemeteries. And so I said, as long as I get equal credit with the dogs, they were cremated and put in these nice bronze busts with pictures and things. I said, as long as I have equal footing, I'm fine with that. So I don't know what's going to happen. I don't care at that point either. So are they helpful? Okay. Okay. You can measure time through what you do. Okay. And that's usually what happens. That's right. They mark seasons like that. Yeah, we tend to have seasonal holidays, for instance. If you've ever thought about that, we have Easter for spring, Memorial Day for summer, Labor Day for fall, and Christmas for winter. We kind of have marked those things as well as that way. Okay, kind of. Okay, they kind of help you keep focused in that way. They okay, and you have to have some kind of structure. If one of the things that happened in the last year when I retired was I understood one thing, and that is I have to get up every morning, and I do the same things I did before. Why? Because I needed the structure. Now my wife says, "Why do you keep doing that?" I say, "I need the structure," and so I keep doing things like that too. Um, can they not be helpful? How?
They take precedence over the way
Okay, if they became the important part of that. Okay, then became an idol for them to worship. One was a tool, one was an idol. Okay. Uh huh. That's right. But it still does it can trigger something. Yeah, it can trigger something. Yeah, it can create some problems that way too. So, pardon? Okay, when they start losing what the reason they were there, uh, when you start asking the question, why do we do this? And people go, I don't know. We just have always done it this way. And it's kind of like that's why the Passover, when God instituted the Passover, the one thing he did with Passover was to say to people, you're going to tell the story every year. So you can say, why do we keep this? Because we were slaves in Egypt. That he wanted to keep what they did connected with what they were, which is an interesting idea. Because something is traditional, does that make it correct? This is where it gets dicey, doesn't it?
It can be correct and be traditional, but being traditional.
Okay. Does church have to start at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings? Why do we start church at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings? Okay. Did the elders really do that? Did they go through this mental process of saying, well, which time should we meet on? Let's start at 6, okay? People go, no, I don't want to do that. Okay. Okay, we bracket it. Okay, that's one way. American culture does that. Well, there are some churches like that in Canada, for instance, where the missionary is up there. Their midweek service is on Thursdays, and and I suppose your midweek service could be anywhere. Our midweek is Wednesday, and I don't know about you, but I have never known it to be any other time. Well, that's a good question. Nobody really knows. Yeah, that's why it's tradition. Yeah, why is it's kind of like in the musical Fiddler on the Roof. They ask Teddy, why do we do that? Tradition, tradition, and that's the reason we do a lot of things. It's not necessarily correct. It doesn't mean it's incorrect either. See, there's the problem with tradition is there are those who are what I call traditionalists who say we need to do it this way, and then there are the iconoclasts that says no, we don't need to do anything traditional, and both of them are messed up. The question needs to be, is this serving the process we have now? That's a good idea. Yes. Okay. You don't have to think through things. And when you don't have, the problem with not thinking through things is they become lost. And that's part of what's going to happen in this class today. Okay, it can become also automatic that you don't think about it. It's almost like, yeah, it's like when your stomach starts to growl, said, I've got to eat. It's that automatic. And so tradition is one of those interesting things that comes up. So how would you define it? Regular practice? Okay. 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 Okay, a regular practice, I would add over time, done for a particular reason that still accomplishes that reason. I'm going to add that little on the end because we're going to talk about that for a moment. Tradition is interesting because this is the way I have decided to define it. Tradition is the accumulated and hardened view of repeated experiences of many. A tradition doesn't happen because you decided. We have had special times where we have, for instance, we used to have a combined auditorium class, and it would meet in the auditorium. And I knew there were people who were in this class and they came and sat through class here in the dark. Why? Because this is where I come to class. See, that's called the hardened experience. You may say that's nutty. Well, I don't know. I don't pass judgment. But if I just described you, don't get mad. I didn't mention your name. But it's not just thought actions though. We tend to think traditions are actions. Traditions are also thought patterns. They're ideas that we carry over and over and over again, and whether or not the idea has not changed over the years. That's the 10 o'clock worship service, by the way. Have you ever tried to propose you change it? Yeah, only once. You only do that one time. I remember years ago, just 20 years ago, we were having troubles because we kind of needed an early service, not because of the size, but because of some of the people. Typical early service is 8:30, isn't it? Okay, that's what ours had been for years. And we decided to do a second early service at 7:30. Would you come to a 7:30 service? You know why we did a 7:30 service? It was because we needed to take about 30 people out of the auditorium for the late service. And that gave us the space in there at 10 o'clock. So 7:30 was in here. There were a few who were here at 6:30 drinking their coffee. And then there were those who complained and said, I don't want to do that at all. That's why we said that's why we had the other service. But I want the early service, but I want 8 o'clock. Well, you can, as Henry Ford would say, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. And so that's kind of the way that is. An effective tradition. There are effective traditions, by the way, things that you do over and over and over again, which are good things. For instance, Hebrews chapter 11 is about I call those the habits of the heart. The faithful people, what did they do over and over and over again? You start with Adam, and you go all the way through all those unnamed people. We can stand with the ancients so we can walk with them. That's what a good tradition does. To go back in time and said, what did these great people of our past do that we need to continue? An excellent type of tradition, by the way. But the problem with tradition is anything that's done in the past, you can install it in stained glass. It becomes immovable. Absolutely immovable. I came across this in my first full-time work. It was first week in June. I had been there for 2.5 months. And an elder got up one Sunday morning and said, remember, we don't have services next Sunday. We're going to cemetery reunion. That one sentence or two sentences perplexed the hound out of me. Number one, I had never not had Sunday morning service. Secondly, what do you do at a cemetery reunion? Now, I was from the city, they were in the country, and I learned pretty quick, here's the tradition of the cemetery reunion. I was asked to speak the next week. The worst speaking engagement I ever had. Why? Number one, it's outside in June in Central Texas. It's about 85 degrees and mosquitoes everywhere. It's at 8 o'clock in the morning. And there were about 30 women, and they're all up there listening, sort of, while the men are at the back cooking barbecue and drinking beer. Now, I've never been to a church service like that. Don't want to go back. But, but they had done that for 100 years. And after 100 years, it didn't make any difference what was going to happen. They're still going to go to cemetery reunion the second week in June. I have not checked back 40 years later to find out if they still are, but I suspect that some of them are at least. Someone has said, this is Robert Hutchins, who is the editor of the great books of the Western world. He said, in a conversation that has gone on for 25 centuries, all dogmas and point of views appear. Here there are great errors as well as great truths. The word dogma, I even looked that up today because it has a negative connotation. It really simply means that which we've always believed. Dogma is not necessarily bad unless it turns into a weapon that we're going to talk about. But this is the problem with tradition. Tradition can harden into something called traditionalism, the worship of tradition. Now, a lot of people can't tell the difference. Tradition becomes traditionalism when several things happen. When it's not debated but settled. You can't question it. And if you question it, something happens. You lose the reason why you did it in the first place. I always liked the story of the woman who, when she would cook the Sunday pot roast, she would cut the roast in half. Her husband said, why do you cut the roast in half? She said, I don't know. We just always have done that. So she went to her mother and says, why do you cut the roast in half? She said, because that's what I've always done. And so she went to her grandmother and said, why do you cut the roast in half? She said, because the biggest pan I had was for half a roast. Well, they forgot why they did it. When you forget why you do what you did, you need to question what you did in the first place and why you're doing it now. When tradition becomes a weapon of compliance, if you don't do this, you're not a good Christian. You can't go to heaven if you violate this. So tradition has been said is the living faith of the dead, but traditionalism, the dead faith of the living. We're going to meet that today in a man named Bildad. Last week we met Eliphaz. Eliphaz was the older, Bildad of the three friends is the middle one, and Eliphaz stressed my experience. In my experience, this is the way it's been. Bildad hardens that by saying, this is what we've always taught. There's a difference in that. And Bildad is kind of a fierce fellow, if you can say that. He begins his speech this way. How long will you say these things and the words of your mouth be a great wind? He says, you're nothing but a windbag. He tells Job that, by the way. You're but full of hot air. You keep complaining about your plight and you just don't know what to do. You need to stop that. You don't contribute anything to this. You're just saying, I don't like it. So stop saying that. You're just a big bag of wind. Imagine telling someone in the shape that Job is in, you don't have a right to complain. Shut up. That's what he did. That's what that verse means, by the way. So that's how he opens it. He makes a couple of arguments here. Argument number one is, we know what the truth is because all you've got to do is look at how God is. Now, we make that argument about a lot of things, don't we? How God is. You know what the problem with arguing how God is? We don't argue all of it. And Bildad doesn't either. Instead, he goes on and says, does God pervert or bend justice, or does the Almighty bend the right? Do you think that's right? Does God pervert justice? Well, that sounds like a loaded question, doesn't it? Yeah. No, God doesn't. Okay. Or yes, God does. I don't care what you say. It's not going to be the right answer. He's asking this question to Job. Look at the nature of God. Does God do this? And then he goes to this verse and he says, if your children, he brings his dead children into the conversation. Think about how bad that is. If your children have sinned against him, he's delivered them into the hands of their transgression. They died because of their sin. Not a great counselor. Don't say that to anybody. And that's a real problem that he has. And Job, he's just crushing Job with every blow. His logic is this. And there is logic behind it, by the way. He says, people who sin are punished. That's that first slide we showed you, the verse he had. The second is, punishment comes in the form of suffering. We usually agree with that, don't we? You know, if a kid cries, a parent may say, if you keep that up, I'm going to give you something to cry about. Well, see, in other words, I'm going to make you feel something bad. Usually when people feel things that are not very good, they quit doing those. They do something else. And so punishment comes in the form of suffering. Job, you're suffering. That means you're being punished. And that means you have sinned. That's the logic of this passage. Job, God punishes sinners with suffering. You're suffering, therefore you must have sinned. Hard to argue with that, except to say that's not right. Problem, as soon as you say that's not right, you have other problems. And his remedy is exactly the same as Eliphaz's remedy. The way you stop all of this mess is if you seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy. If you're pure and upright, he'll finally rouse himself and restore your rightful habitation. And though your beginning was small, your latter days will be very great. He has one thing right in this passage, the last verse, the last part of this verse. Job's last days will be great. But it won't be because of everything before. He says, Job, you've sinned. You need to repent. You need to find out what it is. I don't care what it is. That's what Eliphaz says. I don't know what it is, but you need to find out where you went wrong here and fix this. Bildad just says, you get wrong. If you'll get right, you'll be fine. You know, sometimes we tell people, if you'll just get right with the Lord, your life will go better. Not necessarily. But I think what they've done is they have, for lack of a better term, they've got God in a box. They got him all wrapped up and control him. You know, now that's not a foreign concept in the Old Testament. In Jeremiah chapter 7, that's what Jeremiah basically accused them of saying. Since you think you've got God caught up in this temple over here, you think you're going to be fine because you got him collected. It's not necessarily true. I always like what Augustine said. He said, any God that I can get my complete mind around ceases to be God. That's, Bildad seems to say, I've got my whole mind around this. And what has happened is he's left a lot of things out. He's missing the nature of the mercy. Now here's the problem. We see in the Old Testament God's judgment being exercised. You see it at flood. You see it at Tower of Babel. You see it at the expulsion of the Egyptians. Get it? You got the sin of Israel, and they are in Moab, and so they get defeated. You see it in Joshua, you see it in Judges, you see it in 1st and 2nd Samuel. I can go through every book of the Old Testament and say that. And a lot of people therefore say God is a God of anger. He's always angry with people. He's watching for them to slip. It's like a teacher I had once. They were watching to make sure everything that you did wrong. They loved red pencils. They'd wear out red pencils. All the things that are wrong with you. And never would try to help you any. And so that was true. That's true about him. But see, when you get to the New Testament, a lot of people assume, well, Jesus dies on the cross. He's a God of love. And therefore we have this dichotomy. God is only judgment or God is only love. Both of those are wrong. God is both love and judgment because the love of God creates the judgment of God, and the judgment of God creates the love of God. That is about 4 years worth of stuff right there. I'm not going into any more. But he left out the other part of his nature, which is mercy. He doesn't know everything God's doing. But this other thing, the second argument, is what nature teaches. Look around you, he says. You just look around. He says, for instance, let's go back to the bygone days. Here's the statement he makes that is tradition. For inquire, please, of bygone ages, and consider what our fathers have searched out. Well, we got this thing figured out a long time ago. When I was a young preacher, I remember when things these little controversies would fire up, there would be always some older guy that would say, and we solved that back in the 50s. I was tempted to say, if you solved it in the 50s, it wouldn't be a problem in the 70s. Yeah, it hadn't been fixed yet. So he says the fathers have searched this out, but we're newbies. We're brand new. We don't know enough, and so we need to go back and find out what the fathers have said. We're just like a shadow on earth right now, and if you'll ask them, they'll teach you what you need to know. He goes on to this way. He says, look at papyrus. Papyrus is a plant that grows in water. On the banks of the Nile River, there are huge papyrus plants. Most of the paper of the ancient world came off of those deltas. And the reason is it was wet. It was wet. And so it grew quite well. Well, but when it would dry out, flower would fade, and it would be cut down. He makes the argument, we are nothing different than papyrus, that we can do well in the right atmosphere, and the atmosphere is righteousness. But you take the righteousness out of the way, and God's going to lop you off with a scythe. And that's why you're suffering the way you are. You left the environment you needed to live in, the environment of righteousness. Or he says, go to the spider's web. Spider's webs are interesting. We had one at our house. My wife got upset because our yard guy took it down. She liked to look at it because when the morning sun would show in, the spider web, she would just look at that. Well, all it took was a yard blower to knock it over, okay? That's what he says. He said, you have been talking about how good how your confidence, how your faith is. He said, but it was like a spider's web. You lean up against it, it falls over. It doesn't endure. He says, that's the nature of life. And so he goes on to say, like a lush plant before the sun, shoots are spread over, but then all of a sudden they're cut down. He said, God will not reject the blameless man, nor take the hand of evildoers. He will always, this is the term, he will always bless the righteous and always punish the sinner. We know that's not true. But that's what tradition held. If you were a good man, you were not going to suffer in life. But if you were evil, you would be afflicted with plagues. So what happens when somebody is afflicted with plagues? You know what it is. In a sense, tradition is common sense. And when people talk about common sense, you ever think about that word? You know, if we had enough common sense in this world, we wouldn't have any of the problems we have. But the reason we have all the problems we have because we've always had these problems, and therefore we have the common sense. That's something for you to sleep on tonight, I know. But this is when you rely on common sense, it says that you are a sinner in need of repentance. That's what the common sense would be. Oh, Job, I can prescribe. You need to get your heart right with God. Now, can you rely on common sense?
No.
Okay. Here's what common. This is Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. You know what common sense was about? Me and my friends think it's this way. I'm not saying it wasn't a great piece of literature. I'm saying that's what it was we got together and decided this is what life ought to be. It's common sense. Job makes a response. He has three painful questions. One, he said, how can I be righteous before God? His response, if I wish to contend with him, contend does not mean fight. It means to go to court, by the way. If we could appear together where we could plead our cases, how could I answer him? He knows so much more than I do. He's got a better vocabulary. He's smart. I'm not. How am I going to make sense of all of this? He says, I can't do that. The second thing, he says, how can I plead my case? I'm on my own. How can I answer him? Choosing words with him. What words would you say to God to make an argument that he would listen to? There's a question. He says, though I am in the right, Job maintains his innocence. My own mouth would condemn me. Though I am blameless, he would prove me perverse. God can prove any of us unworthy. Job knew that. He was not naive about what was happening. And so he said, I need a mediator. Now the concept of mediator is a big concept in the book of Job. However, I don't care that the song says, I know that my Redeemer lives. Come the book of Job. Jesus is not in the picture, at least on earth, the historical part of what the New Testament teaches. What he's saying is, I need someone who can listen to my side, listen to God's side, and bring us together so that God will see what the reality is. I need someone who can speak to God. Now, he says, there is no arbitrator between us who might lay his hands on both of us, who can touch both equally. Now, the day will come where this will change. But in Job's time, Job is struggling with the same idea that those always did. I have no way of directly persuading God. The third question is, why was I born? He says, your hands have fashioned me and made me, and now you've destroyed me altogether. Remember, you made me like clay, and will you return me to the dust? So you poured me out like milk and curdled me like cheese. What powerful expressions. Why was I born? A couple of weeks ago, Vicki and I had a close friend who was our neighbor in our previous town for 14 years. We raised our kids together. A year ago, he was diagnosed with ALS, and he died 2 weeks ago. And he was a little bit older than I am, but not enough to make a difference. It was enough to make me feel my own mortality, let's put it that way. We went to his funeral on Friday. When he had gotten the diagnosis of his disease, he went to the preacher to ask the hard questions, what Job's doing. His question was, why did I get this disease? try to answer a question like that. There are some things you can get because of what you've done. You can smoke yourself into lung cancer. You can drink yourself into liver disease. ALS doesn't happen that way. So the preacher finally explained to him, and I think this is maybe the best answer I've heard to this. You want to know the reason you have this disease? You were born. Because you're alive, this is what your plight is. It's the only reason there is. Human beings get sick of no reason of their own. That's what Job is saying. The only reason I'm suffering is because I was born. So if I wouldn't have been born, I wouldn't be suffering. A powerful element there. He goes on to say, would that I had died before any eye has seen me, and were as that I had not been been carried from the womb to the grave. It would have been better had I not had life. Because if I didn't have life, I wouldn't be suffering. Same thing he says in Job 3. Job feels painted into a corner. He's been presented twice now with the concept that if you'll just get your heart right with God, your pain will disappear, but he has done nothing wrong to repent of, so he doesn't know how to get out of this, and so he continues to suffer. What do I do? Hard question. Beware easy answers of the past. They may not be relevant. I like what H.L. Mencken said. He said there is always an easy solution to every problem. Neat, plausible, and wrong. When people give you easy answers, they probably are not right. And the reason is what Herodotus has said. Herodotus has said, you cannot step in the same river twice. It is neither the same river nor are you the same man. Things keep changing. So just the tradition that you have, you always have to question the idea, is this still valid for what we need to do? That's an interesting idea, but it's hard to deal with. 3 things real quickly as we close. When people are hurting, don't minimize their pain. That's what Bildad says. You're nothing but a windbag. If you just stop complaining, you feel better. Have you ever seen someone been told, cheer up, it'll be okay? Time heals all wounds. God is in control. Now, most of those are true, sort of. But when you're the one hearing them, it doesn't soothe anything. It doesn't help you. So don't minimize the pain. Realize that it's real and there's a good reason for it. When miserable, philosophy doesn't help. I knew a guy one time that he talked to another guy whose mother was dying. The guy was struggling with his mother dying. And he said, that's life. Called philosophy. Philosophy doesn't work all the time. It sounds good. It sells well. But it doesn't make you feel better. It doesn't give you an answer you really need to have. And the third is that Christians have what Job didn't have. A mediator. Today, one thing is different. If you don't understand life, you have someone to go to who can explain it to God, and God can explain it to you. And we are not lost and hopeless any longer. And because of that, we have a benefit that is greater than can be imagined. Next week, we're going to meet number 3. His name is Zophar. Zophar does not have lasting effort. He makes a speech and says, I'm done. So we're going to listen to what he has to say next week.